guys thankful for Pastor Amy? Can you, yeah? Okay, good. Me too. There was a Sunday about a year ago. Do you ever do the thing where you have a dream about someone and you get real mad at them in the dream? And then in real life, you're like, I know I'm not supposed to be real mad at you right now, but I'm still kind of mad at you. There was a Sunday about a year ago where I came in here and Amy and I crossed paths and she was real, you know? And I was like, I don't remember offending her. And she's like, you didn't, but I had a dream and now I'm super mad at you. And that was like a year ago. And I still, like when we're like a minute ago coming up on stage after her, I'm like, don't get too close because she might still be mad. I'm always checking every Sunday morning. I'm like, how we doing? Are we okay? Are you mad at me? Hey, if you're, a couple announcements before we jump in. If you haven't signed up yet, we have our Pelicans game. Our annual Pelicans game we go to as a church is this week. And normally I wouldn't make this announcement except that today is the last day that you can sign up. Tomorrow is the cutoff, and then everybody who signed up will go. This is a great opportunity to go watch the game, but also to eat together. The food is all taken care of. Like the kids can run around. It's such a great multi-generational opportunity for our church to engage outside of the church that we do it every year as one of our staple summer events, right? And you can sign up for that right now. It won't offend me a bit if you pulled out your phone and you pointed your camera at that QR and just followed the prompts there. And then two, I don't want to forget to say this because as I look around, there's so many new faces, and there's going to continue being new faces. That's been the case all summer. And so we have something coming up called Welcome to Midtown, something we're very proud of. It's a lunch after our second service. The next one will be on August 30th. It's a less than an hour long. Childcare is provided. The food is free. We sit and we eat together. And if you're looking for, like, I want to know more about the church. I want to hear more about your story. What do you believe? Who's in charge of what? How do you guys operate? How do I get connected? What's my next step? All of those questions get answered at Welcome to Midtown. And so if you've been kind of checking things out and popping by, stopping in, and you're like, what's my next step? Maybe today's your first Sunday. Maybe you've been here for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and you're like, I don't know the answer to any of those questions. This would be a great lunch for you to also go to. So it's really for anybody who wants to take another step. We just want you to always know what your next step is. So you can sign up for that the same way. You can pull out your phones right now, won't be offended, and point your camera at the screen, follow that QR to where it leads you to sign up to be a part of that. All good there? Those are our two big announcements. As I was praying this morning and I was thinking about this series and this service and this message, I thought I should share with you, like, I write these messages so far in this season, I'm about 7 weeks ahead, which is unusual for me to be that far ahead, but 7 weeks, which as you can imagine, you pour over something and you pray about it and you write. And I usually do that real early in the mornings. It feels like that's when God is clearest to me. And then you live about 7 weeks of life. And then you come back up on a message that you wrote 7 weeks ago as you pour over it and pray over it. And it just hits you in an entirely new way. And I all throughout this series, as we've been studying these characters that are mentioned in Hebrews chapter 12, or 11, it has felt that way for me. That God is kind of speaking to something that I didn't know I'd be walking out in the time in between. And so that is kind of how I approached this morning. And I hope that you know, one of the things that we say around here is what we do together. We follow Jesus together in everyday life. And I want you to hear, as your pastor, like I'm trying to do that too. I hope you hear a humility in me as it's like I'm trying to follow Jesus myself. And a lot of these messages are kind of reminding me how to better follow Jesus together with you in everyday life. I love something that Rich Mullins said a long time ago. He said the scriptures weren't given to us so that people could say how right they are about everything, but to humble us into seeing that God is right and the rest of us are just guessing. And so as one fellow sojourner to another, that's how we approach this book, this text. So as we begin this morning, as we jump in, I wanted to start off with this question, and it's this: have you ever been asked to do something? And probably the answer, yes. That's not the whole question. Have you ever been asked to do something that you knew was wrong? You don't have to answer out loud. Don't cut your eyes at somebody else in the room. Have you ever had to choose? Maybe you've been in this position before. Have you ever had to choose between what was safe and what was right? Have you ever wondered whether one quiet act of obedience could really make a difference? Like, does it really matter if I'm honest right now? Does it really matter if I do the right thing? Or maybe this question is a better one for where we're going. What if history changes because extraordinary people, or not because extraordinary people do extraordinary things, but because ordinary people quietly refuse to be ruled by fear? We're nearing the end of a series that we've been calling Big Faith. And just a quick word about where we're going with this series. We're coming up on the end of it. And then on September 13th, you should know this, we're doing something called Vision Sunday, which is a Sunday that we've set aside just to celebrate where we've been over the past year and look forward to where we're going as a church. You're not going to notice any difference in our programming that Sunday morning, but it's something I'm really excited about. God all the time through Scripture commands his people to stop and remember, and to sort of recalibrate into where they're going. So September 13th, we're going to do that. It's called Vision Sunday. And then September 20th, the week after that, we're going to have a special time called Midtown Together. Essentially, the first service won't exist that day. We're all going to be in the same room because we think, you know what, if we're saying that we're following Jesus together in everyday life, maybe one Sunday we should just all worship together in everyday life. And then after that service, we're going to go out into the back lot. We're going to have games and food all set up as a way to just basically have a church picnic. So all of us could literally be together as we kickstart the year. And then after that Sunday, we're going to begin examining the book in the New Testament called Ephesians, where the Apostle Paul describes what we're becoming as we become something new together. The we in that, the you in that is all plural, who we're becoming as we follow Jesus together. So that's where we're headed. That's where we're going to continue focusing over the next several months and several weeks. And today, where we are is nearing the end of a series that we've been calling Big Faith. And what we've said at the start of this series is that we believe that what God wants for you, we believe that what Jesus wants for you, and even though we may not know each other, what I want for you is for everybody in the room to have a really, really, really big faith, like a big, robust, unshakable, unbreakable, unquenchable faith in God that isn't just in your mind, but is something that is actually lived out. As you follow Jesus, you can follow him with faith. And to do this, we've been looking at a book of the Bible called Hebrews. We've been studying that for the entire year. It's at the end of your New Testament, kind of a big book. And then the 11th chapter of this book, the author stops and he pivots. He goes, you know what? In order to understand what faith is, I need you to see what faith does. And he begins listing character after character after character from the Old Testament, the greatest hits from the Bible, the Old Testament, and what's called by many people the hall of faith. Just person after person who exhibited great faith, who illustrated, personified what it means to follow Jesus with great faith. And so we said as a result of this, in the first week of this series, that faith is trusting God enough to do what he says. Trusting God enough to do what he says. In the second week, we said that faith sees deeper than sight alone can see. In the next week, we said that faith chooses trust over anxiety. In the fourth week, we said that faith trusts God over, or walks with God over a lifetime. We saw this played out in the life of a man named Enoch. In the fifth week, we said faith obeys before it understands. And we watched an old man named Noah build an ark to show us this lesson. In the sixth week, we said that faith is trusting God enough to take the next step, even when you cannot see the entire path ahead. And to understand that, we looked at a man named Abraham. And then the week after that, we met Abraham's wife named Sarah, who taught us that faith considers God faithful. The week after that, we talked about faith using words to speak life into the future. And then this past week, we said that faith lives beyond itself. Faith invests in futures that it may never actually itself personally enjoy. And today we're going to discover something about faith. And what we're going to discover about faith is that faith doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes faith looks like two ordinary people making a very difficult decision. And what we learn is that sometimes great faith, the greatest acts of faith happen quietly, behind closed doors, when no one is watching. Today, we're going to learn that faith chooses courage over fear. So if you have your Bibles or if you're just following along on the screens, we're going to continue in Hebrews chapter 11. This time we're in verse 23 where the author says this, by faith, Moses' parents, pause, I love this. We all know Moses from the Old Testament. Moses is a big figure in the Old Testament, one of the central figures of the Old Testament. He gets a huge portion of Hebrews chapter 11. But before we get to Moses, the author goes, we're going to talk about Moses' parents. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. This is another one of those verses that it would be very easy to just pass over, right? We could just read right over it. You're like, I get it. You know, the story, there's 2 parents, there's a baby, there's 3 months, end of story. We can move on. But the author doesn't think that this is a small story. In fact, this is so important to the author that he says, before we even get to Moses, I want you to stop and I want to talk about Moses' mom and dad. Just think about that for a minute. The greatest leader in Israel's history, the man who famously confronted Pharaoh, the man who parted the Red Sea, the man who received on the mountaintop the 10 commandments from the fingertips of God, the man who led Israel through the wilderness. Before Hebrews ever says, by faith, Moses, Hebrews says, by faith, Moses' parents. I love that because before there was a great man of faith, there were 2 ordinary people who had to make one courageous decision. And I think that's exactly the point, right? History often remembers the person standing on the stage, but doesn't Hebrews teach us that God often remembers the people standing behind them? And there's a lot more going on in the background than what we see on the stage. Now, to appreciate their courage, we have to appreciate the world that Moses' parents were living in because Moses wasn't born, and you know this, into peaceful circumstances. He was born into oppression. Generations earlier, we saw this when we studied Joseph's life. Joseph saved Egypt from famine. Joseph was able to see by a dream ability to interpret the Pharaoh's dream that God gave him. He was able to see that a famine was coming. And so he was able to save not just Egypt, but also Israel. The Hebrews moved into Egypt to be spared from the plague. And Exodus begins with one of the saddest sentences in all of the Bible. It says that a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Isn't that haunting? A new king to whom Joseph's second in command over Egypt. And then suddenly one generation remembers Joseph and then the next generation forgets. And suddenly the people who had once been welcomed, they were welcomed into Egypt to be spared. Now they've become feared. The people who once had been honored now are enslaved. The Hebrews multiply. Pharaoh becomes afraid and Fear has a way of making people do terrible things. First, Pharaoh works them harder. Then he orders, and you know the story, the Hebrew midwives to kill every baby boy at birth. And as unimaginable as that sounds, it gets darker still because when that fails, he issues an even darker decree. He wants every Hebrew boy thrown into the Nile. Can you imagine living under that? Every pregnancy now is filled with fear, a time that should be exciting. Every birth is overshadowed by grief. Every cry of a newborn could be a death sentence. All right, this isn't merely political oppression. This is state-sponsored evil. And into that world, a little boy named Moses is born. Now, imagine you're Moses' parents. The Bible tells us later that their names are Amram and Jochebed. They weren't kings, they weren't prophets, they weren't priests. As far as we know, they were 2 ordinary people simply trying to raise a family in an extraordinarily broken world. And one day, Jochebed, she gives birth to a son. Now here's the question. What do faithful people do when obedience becomes dangerous? What do faithful people do when obedience becomes dangerous? Because they have a decision to make. Do they obey the Pharaoh or do they obey God? Do they protect themselves or do they protect the child? And these aren't theoretical questions anymore. They're standing in the nursery. They're holding the baby. Every cry from this baby could be heard. Every knock at every door could mean soldiers. Every passing day increased the risk. Can you imagine what those first few months must have been like? Every morning waking up wondering, is today the day? What if today's the day that we get caught? Every night whispering prayers over a baby who can't understand a single word, but maybe somehow your whispers are helping keep him hushed. You're trying to keep him quiet. You're trying to keep him hidden. You're trying to keep him alive. And Hebrews tells us why they did it. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw, and I love this phrase, that he was no ordinary child. Right? That phrase has always fascinated me. They could see, he was no ordinary child because every parent thinks their baby is extraordinary. Am I right? You ever noticed that? Every grandparent has the smartest grandkid in the world. Every parent is convinced that their child is gifted, and they should be. Right? Facebook has this feature where it now shows you stuff that you posted from years before. I've had this haunting, I don't know if you've ever had this embarrassing thing happen to you where you're like, I was so obnoxious so long ago. Like thank God I'm not obnoxious anymore. When my son, who's 16, that was not a joke. Some of y'all, Amy laughed. She's going to swing at me. I'm going to need an escort after church. 16 years ago when Benjamin was born, I would film him doing, well, at the time, I thought he was doing these brilliant things, like sitting up, or there's one where he has his eyes open. There's another time he was crying, and I'm just filming it. I'm like, y'all look, history in the making, you know? And now I'm looking back, and even I'm going, it looks like a baby, right? It looks like, everybody thinks their child is extraordinary. We should think that, right? So what does Hebrews mean? Was Moses glowing? Did he have some sort of supernatural aura? Did his parents receive a prophecy? I mean, maybe one of those things happens, but that's actually not what Exodus, when you look at Exodus, the book of Exodus, it emphasizes something else. Exodus says this, when she saw that he was a fine child, this is chapter 2, verse 2, says that Jochebed, when she had Moses, she saw that he was a fine child. The word fine there can mean beautiful or healthy or good. In other words, they looked at this little boy and they saw what every loving parent sees. They see a child made in the image of God. They see a life worth protecting. I don't think that their faith began because they knew Moses would become Moses. I think their faith began because they believed every child bears the dignity of God's image. They didn't know, they couldn't know that they would be saving the future deliverer of Israel. They were simply refusing to participate in evil. And sometimes that's what faith looks like. It's not huge. It's just like, I'm not participating in evil. You don't know how God is going to use your obedience. They don't know how God is going to use their obedience. They simply know that obedience is the right thing to do. And that's what this story is really all about. It's not about hiding. It's not about baskets. It's not even about babies. It's about courage. It's about courage. The writer of Hebrews tells us exactly what distinguished Moses' parents. He says this, that they were not afraid. They were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, I want to be careful here because them not being afraid doesn't mean that they never felt fear. I bet they felt so much fear. I bet they felt so much fear every single day. Every time the soldiers walked by, every time the baby cried, Every time a family they knew lost another child, every time another decree was announced from Pharaoh, courage is not the absence of fear. This is important. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is deciding that something else matters more. Something else is more important. Faith, this is important, does not eliminate fear. Faith teaches fear who sits on the throne. That's why Hebrews doesn't say that they ignored Pharaoh. It says that they weren't ruled by Pharaoh. His decree was real. His power was real. His danger was real. But to them, God's authority was greater. And that's the difference. Where fear asks, what if I obey God and everything falls apart? Faith says, yeah, but what if I don't obey God? What if I don't obey? One of my favorite commands in all of Scripture is the command that's repeated more than any other. Do not be afraid. And God has to say it an awful lot. He says it to Abraham, says it to Joshua, says it to Gideon, says it to Mary, he says it to Joseph, says it to the shepherds and to the disciples again and again and again. Why? Because fear has always been, look up here, fear has always been one of the greatest competitors to faith. Not doubt. Fear has always been one of the greatest competitors to faith. Not doubt. Fear whispers, protect yourself. Faith whispers, trust me. Fear says, play it safe. Faith says, be faithful. Fear asks, what's going to happen to me? Faith asks, what does God want from me? And every single one of our lives, isn't this true? Every single one of us lives somewhere in that tension. Not with Pharaoh, but with our own fears. That's why he has to put it in there so many times. Because we all have our fears. Fear of losing a job, the fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood, fear of failure, fear of standing alone, fear of doing the right thing even when everyone else is doing the easy thing. You guys, this is where this story becomes our story. This is our story. Because very few of us will ever be asked to hide a baby from a king. But every single one of us will have to decide, will fear make this decision? Or will faith make this decision? Every one of us lives there. Now, eventually, 3 months go by and hiding becomes impossible. Babies grow. Their lungs become louder. Their cries get stronger. The hiding place that once felt so secure becomes impossible to maintain. Can you imagine that moment? Imagine Jochebed looking at her son, knowing that she had done everything that she could do. She had prayed every prayer. She had taken every precaution. She had surrounded the hut with leaves to try to absorb the sound. She stayed awake every night. And now she has reached the end of what she can control. She's reached the end of what she can control. And I think every parent knows that feeling. I think every human being knows that feeling. The moment that you've done everything that you know to do, and now the outcome is no longer in your hands. You've reached the edge of what you're able to control. And for some of us who like to control outcomes, that powerlessness is paralyzing. She's reached the edge of what she's able to control. But I love what she does next. The scriptures say that she builds a basket. Now, our English translation of the Bibles, it's called a basket, but in our Hebrew translations of the Bible, the word is fascinating. It's the word tevah. Do you know the other place, the only other place in the entire Old Testament where this word appears? It's in Genesis. It's in Noah's Ark, the story of Noah's Ark, when it says that God looks down and he knows it's about to flood for 40 days and nights. And so he finds an old guy named Noah and he says, I need you to build me a tevah, not a boat, not a canoe, not a basket, an ark. And I don't think that that's on accident. The author here wants us to remember another story, another impossible situation, another family, another act of faith, another vessel floating on dangerous waters. In Noah's day, God preserved humanity through an ark. In Moses' day, God would preserve Israel's deliverer through a tiny ark. Think about this. Jochebed, she couldn't stop the Nile. She couldn't stop Pharaoh. She couldn't control the future, but she could build an ark. It doesn't guarantee the outcome. She could only choose obedience. And often that's what faith looks like. Not controlling the outcome, but entrusting the outcome to God. I love this because look what faith doesn't do. Faith doesn't magically make the danger disappear. Faith doesn't prevent them from having to make a hard decision. Faith doesn't spare her from her emotions or her tears. She still has to place her baby in the river. She still has to let go. Sometimes we imagine faith means God removes every painful circumstance, but often faith is what gives us the courage to release into God's hands what we can no longer hold on to ourselves. And that's what Jochebed does. She lets go without giving up. Those are not the same thing. She lets go without giving up. And those two things are not the same thing. Jochebed, she builds this tiny little ark. She coats it with tar and pitch until it's watertight. She wraps her son in a blanket. Maybe she kisses his forehead one last time. Maybe she whispers one last prayer as she places him in, and then she places him in the Nile. Can you imagine how difficult that would have been? To place your son in the Nile. As parents, we spend our lives trying to protect our children from danger. She intentionally places hers in danger. Not because she has no faith, but because her faith has brought her to the edge of what she can control. She just can't control anymore. She's done everything that obedience has required her to do. Now the rest belongs to God. She places him in the ark and places the ark in the water. And this little ark begins to drift. And the current carries it downstream. Miriam, Moses' sister, she's following from a distance, watching, waiting, wondering. And you guys know this story. Without Jochebed knowing it, without Miriam knowing it, without Moses understanding it, someone else is walking down toward the river. Not a Hebrew mother, not an Israelite midwife, but Pharaoh's daughter. I love the timing of God because while Jochebed is letting go, God is already putting someone else in motion. You ever notice that? Before the basket ever reaches the reeds, God already knows who he's sending down to the river. Before Moses is ever discovered, God has already been prearranging the meeting. Church, isn't it amazing how often God is working in places we cannot yet see him? Jochebed, she could only see the bend in the river. God could see the whole river. Jochebed could only see the basket. God could see the whole palace. She could only see today, and God goes, I stand outside of today. I can see 40 years from now, 80 years from now, 120 years from now. And isn't that so often how God works? Rarely do we see what he's doing in the moment. Usually, only looking back can we look back and realize, oh, he was already there. Joseph couldn't see it from the bottom of his pit. Ruth couldn't see it while she was out gleaning in a field. Esther couldn't see it when she entered the palace. The disciples couldn't see it that Good Friday. But later, looking back, they realized God has been weaving together a story from the start that I just couldn't yet understand. And that is called providence. Providence doesn't mean that everything makes sense. It means that God is still governing the story even when things do not make sense. That God is still in charge. And I wonder how many of us are living in a moment right now that simply doesn't make sense. You've obeyed. You've prayed. You've done the next right thing. And now all you can see is a basket floating down a river. Can I just encourage you with something? That just because you can't see God working doesn't mean that he's not already there. Because while you're watching the river, God is already moving people, opening doors, closing doors, preparing conversations, changing hearts, arranging circumstances that you'll only understand years from now. And that's what he was doing for Jochebed, and that's what he has still been doing for his people to this day. And now the story takes an incredible turn. Pharaoh's daughter walks down to the Nile to bathe. She notices something floating among the reeds. She sends one of her attendants to go fetch it for her, and they open a tiny little ark, and inside there's a baby Hebrew boy crying. And Exodus tells us something remarkable. It says that when she looks down, she felt sorry for him. Don't miss that. The king's decree said you should get rid of him, exterminate him, kill him. But compassion interrupted that decree. And I love what happens next. Before Pharaoh's daughter can even decide what to do, before she can even get a word out, a little girl steps out from behind the reeds, Miriam. And she says, oh, she walks up to the daughter of the most powerful man in the world. Can you imagine the courage that took? She walks up to the daughter of the most powerful man in the world, and she says, oh, a baby. Would you like for me to go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse this baby for you? And Pharaoh's daughter, she says, yes, I would like for you to do that. Guess who Miriam goes and gets? Mom. Just stop and appreciate God's sense of humor. Jochebed obeys God. She places her son into the river. She releases what she loves most. And a few minutes later, she's hired by the king of the world to raise her own son for pay. Pharaoh is now literally financing the preservation of the very child who will one day confront him and ruin his workforce. He's financing it. You couldn't write a better story unless God's the one writing it. Isn't that just like God? He delights in overturning the plans of the powerful. He delights in using what appears weak. He delights in accomplishing his purposes, especially the ones that no one sees coming. Pharaoh thinks that he's writing history, and God goes, oh, that's cute. I've been writing it all along. And I think it's important to slow down here because if we're not careful, we'll walk away with the wrong lesson. The lesson is not, if you obey God, everything's going to work out for you exactly like you hoped. Sometimes it doesn't. Hebrews 11 itself won't let us believe that, right? Some of the people in Hebrews 11 escaped, but some of them were imprisoned. Some conquered kingdoms, but others were tortured. Some received miracles, and others died waiting. So the point isn't that obedience always produces immediate rescue. The point is this, that God can be trusted with the outcome because he's writing a story larger than the one we can see. Jochebed couldn't see that story. Miriam couldn't see that story. Tiny Moses in the ark couldn't see that story. But God could, and that's enough. We have a God who sees the whole story. And there's something beautiful about the way the Bible tells us this story, because thousands of years later, after Moses was born under a sentence of death, we would read of another baby born under the sentence of death. Thousands of years later, after Pharaoh ordered the death of Hebrew boys, we'd read of another Herod who would order the death of Bethlehem boys. Moses was preserved to deliver God's people from slavery. Years later, we would meet a Jesus who would be preserved to deliver God's people from sin and death. Moses would eventually lead Israel through the waters, and Jesus would eventually lead us through death itself. The Bible isn't just giving us another hero to admire. The Bible is preparing us for the greater deliverer who is still to come. And here's the beautiful news. The same God, this gives me goosebumps to say, the same God who watched over a little ark floating down the Nile, the same God who frustrated Pharaoh's plans, the same God who quietly worked behind the scenes while no one could see and got Jochebed paid to raise her own son, the same God who did all that is the same God that we worship today. He has not changed. He is the same, the scriptures say, yesterday, today, and forever. And the reason this is important is because some of you today are standing where Jochebed stood. You've done everything that you know to do. You've prayed, you obeyed, you trusted, and now you've reached the edge of what you can control. You've got a basket in your hands. Maybe for you it's a child. Maybe it's a marriage. Maybe it's a career. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's a dream that you've carried for years. Maybe it's something that you've been trying to fix that you simply cannot fix in your own strength. Today, God's not asking you to know how the story ends. He's asking you to trust the author. Because faith isn't knowing what's around the bend in the river. Faith is knowing who rules the river. And that's why Hebrews remembers Moses' parents. Not because they controlled the outcome, they couldn't control the outcome. But they trusted the one who did. They released. So today, we've all got a basket. Can you choose trust over fear? Can you choose courage over fear? Can you choose faith over fear? Do the next right thing. Obey what God's placed in front of you. And once you've done everything obedience requires, can you entrust the rest to Him? Because our God has always been writing better stories than people could ever imagine. He always has been, and He still is. Father, there's a reason that you preserved this story for us all these years, and it's bigger than just the story, because it's our story. Church, as I think about the folks in this room, just think about how many baskets must be represented. How many situations, things that you've carried as far as you could. You've held on to as long as you can. You've controlled what you can control, but now the outcome isn't in your hands. And I just wonder, church, this morning, if there's a God who's welcoming you and asking you to trust Him, to release it, to let it go, and to allow Him to write a better story than the one you can imagine. So in a moment, church, we're going to stand to our feet. We're going to sing a song. called Build My Life. And as we sing these words, I just want you to imagine yourself letting these baskets go, sending them into the river. Not recklessly, but trusting the God who can do more than you could even imagine. As we prepare for this moment, if you're in a spot where you want to process some of that with someone, my friend Roy here to my right from our prayer team, he'd love to pray with you. I don't know if you know what a gift it is to be prayed over, but boy, I'd love for you to experience that today. If part of letting your basket go requires you to come up here and use these kneelers or light a candle. And for some of us, maybe it's just something that we write down. We're struggling to leave the basket in the water. I met a woman after first service who said, I put it in the water, I just keep going after it. You can write that on the back of a prayer card and drop it in that blue box on your way out. We'd love to pray for you this week. But Holy Spirit, we want this moment to be the one where we kiss the baby's foreheads. We wrap them up tight. But we release. We release to a God who's been telling pretty incredible stories for a very long time.